Okay, my name is Jane Eliasof, and I'm the Executive Director of the Montclair History Center. And I'm tonight's presenter as well. So you get two of me this time. We've got a really fun set of programs set up for the fall, and I'll go into them at the beginning of my presentation because we have so many that I actually want to make sure I could write them down for you all as opposed to just rattling them off. So I'll show you those in just a minute. The storm was quite remarkable a couple of hours ago. A lot of you did ask how we fared during Ida, and I'm pleased to say the History Center did pretty well. We had some water in the basement of the Nathaniel Crane house, but really that was about it. And considering what some people are going through still with that, I consider ourselves pretty lucky. As you probably know, if you've been here before, we've been doing these since April 2020. They've always been free. They've always been no registration. So if you would like to receive our email blasts, we have not captured your email in this, so you won't hear from unless you tell us you want to hear from us. So put your email in the chat and we will then make sure that we send you information about upcoming programs. If you would like to donate, you can do that on our website, which is montclairhistory.org. You can do that via Venmo or Zelle if you use either of those two methods. You can also send a check, and our address is 108 Orange Road, Montclair, New Jersey, 07042. But regardless of that, we're thrilled that you're with us tonight. This subject is near and dear to my heart, as you will see, and so I'm excited to be able to share my passion with you. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I'm so drawn to quilts. I'm going to give you a sense of the vocabulary of quilts because some of you who are quilt makers know this, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page when I start flipping around some jargon. We'll talk a very brief history of quilting in America, and then we'll move on to our collection, which is quite extensive and actually not all covered there in here. First off, a confession, I am a quilter. My dining room table usually looks something like this, and I promise you I didn't stage it for this picture. It just happened to be when I was creating the presentation. And I have that stash of fabric that's ubiquitous among quilters. It really is a thing, and it's actually right over to my left. If I shifted my camera, you'd be able to see it. Different people get involved with quilting for different reasons, and mine was this quilt. My grandmother, whose name was also Jane, died when I was just 4 years old. And when my grandfather died about 10 years later, my dad went down to clear out the apartment and he found these quilt squares and he brought them back. And there was just enough of them sewn together that I could see what she was trying to accomplish. But I looked at that and I thought, there's no way that I would ever be able to do it without teaching myself to quilt. Now, I knew my grandmother was a quilter because she usually made pinwheel quilts that looked more like this. In fact, this pink fabric was very much like the one I slept under when I was growing up, except this pinwheel is sort of on a different angle than normal. This is what most of her quilts did look like. So as I said, I wanted to teach myself how to quilt before I actually dug into grandma's quilt. And I did. I made quilts for myself. I made quilts for my friends. I made quilts for my family. I used all different techniques. I tried all different patterns. I made friendship quilts. And I stop on this one because I want to mention it because it has a special memory in my heart. This quilt was one I started right after my daughter was born. And I had learned to make quilts the modern way, and I really wanted to learn the old-fashioned way, by hand. And so I found a course at what was then the Montclair Historical Society back in 1994, and it was taught by Pat Fornoff, who is on tonight. So Pat, I owe you a debt of gratitude. This quilt is a beloved favorite of my daughter's, and it is held up over the test of time for many, many years. She's now 27 years old. I also began to start looking at antique stores and estate sales. For some reason, I'm drawn to quilt tops. This is one with a pine tree block. And I'm also drawn to just plain patches that somebody hasn't finished. And so I picked these up as well. And then I landed at the Montclair Historical Society, and boy, oh boy, oh boy, there's a beautiful collection of quilts there, as you will see. And I was really in heaven. So we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a quilt and the vocabulary. And I apologize to the quilters who are on right now because this is some pretty basic stuff. It's a quilt is like a sandwich. You have a top fabric that's usually decorative in some way. You have a backing fabric that is usually not decorative, although it can be. And then you have a quilt batting in the middle that you can usually pick up on online at Joann's Fabrics, at Michael's. But back in the old days, they might have used another blanket that had seen better days. They might have used just raw sheep wool. They might have used flax. They might have even just used leaves that they gathered together from outside, or hay. Now, the top decorative piece can be done in a number of ways. Probably the one that's most associated with patchwork quilting is the pieced quilt, which is the one on the left-hand side. And what you do there is you just sew little strips or pieces of fabric together into different patterns. This is an around the world quilt that I did for someone a couple of years ago. You can also applique them. This is a pretty basic applique that I did on the right-hand side. You see the background fabric, you cut out a shape and you just put it on, you stitch that onto your background fabric, and you can always see the applique plus the background fabric. This is a whole cloth quilt, and it's, I think, the only one in the presentation that I didn't make, and it's not in the Montclair History Center's collection. Usually this is one large piece of fabric or several large pieces of fabric that are sewn together. There is no design on it. It's a whole cloth. It's usually also often referred to white work. And really what you're doing is you're showing off the skill of the quilter here, as opposed to the design, the piecing. And then the final thing you can do is foundation piece something. This is similar to applique because you have a foundation piece, but in the final block, you never see that foundation, unlike in an applique where you can see that foundation. And then once you have the three pieces of the sandwich, you have to put them all together so they don't slide apart. In the old days, you really had to make sure that your connections between all three were close together. Today, it's a little less important because your batting is not going to shift as much. Probably the easiest, quickest way to put a quilt together is by tying it, as my grandmother did on this quilt. You can quilt it, and this is these running stitches that you see along here. An expert quilter will get about 12 stitches per inch. I usually get around 9 or 10, never quite achieve 12, even when I'm quilting like a mad woman, but it's a goal. And you can see how it takes a long time to get to that level of quilting. The one that I just put up was my very first quilt that I ever did. And you can see the size of the stitches on that compared to the size of the stitches on the one I did about 5 years later. And then this is from that whole cloth quilt that I showed you before. This is machine quilted. And you can see on these that there's sort of areas where they're sort of stuffed. Do you see that right there? And there it raises above. It's almost like there's extra padding in there. And there is. That padding is added. It's either extra cording or just a little extra batting that you stuff in there. And it gives a 3-dimension to the quilt itself. It's called trapunto, or stuffed work, and trapunto in Italian basically just means quilting. So basically what you've got here is quilted quilting. This is also machine done, and that's an art form unto itself. I have never quilted with a machine. I don't have the equipment to do it, and I have never sent my machine quilting or my quilts away to have anybody machine quilted, but I know a lot of people that do. So we're going to start with the history of quilts, and it goes back very long ago. There are some ancient origins. There was a small fragment of patchwork bed canopy that had been found in the tomb excavation in Egypt, dating all the way back to about 980 BCE. There were some decorative silk quilts found in Chinese tombs that dated back as far as 1770 BCE. They tended to use quilts more for rugs, clothing, and even armor in different parts of the world. But one of the earliest documented quilts that's complete is this one that I am showing you. It's called the Tristan quilt because it's based on the legend, the French legend of Tristan and Isolde, which I can't tell you much about other than the fact that I know I had to read it back when I was in high school in French. But it's a beautiful work. There are two that are in museums. This one is from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. There's also one somewhere in private hands. This was made in the 14th century in Sicily, which was a center for quilt making back then. It is a whole cloth quilt, and you can see how there's even some trapunto in it too. So really quite a beautiful quilt. If you happen to be at the Victoria and Albert Museum, make sure you try and find it while you're there. And I'm skipping over a bit of some of its other ancient history because I really want to get to America. As you can imagine, as quilting spread through Europe, it also then began to come over to America with the people who were moving here from Europe. Most of the quilts from the early years of that American settlement are whole cloth quilts that are primarily in the hands of the wealthy families. You rarely see quilting other than in clothing in early American inventories, mainly wealthy people. They were often white, but if they were dyed, it was dyed with usually vegetable produced or plant-based dyes that created browns and reds and blues. This is one of the ones in our collection. And truthfully, like this, it looks kind of bland and not too exciting. But when you get up close to it, it is really remarkable with the stitching. This is all hand stitched, hand quilted, and it's the entire cloth of the entire fabric. And it really is quite spectacular. The skill of this quilter was clearly expert. Here's another one in our collection. This is a unique quilt called a copper plate engraved quilt. It's like a whole cloth quilt, except they used 3 large pieces of fabric that they sewed together. It's called copper plate because in 1783, printers discovered that you could etch a design into copper, then attach the copper to a roller, and then literally crank out pieces of fabric at a really rapid rate. And so they began to do this quite quickly, and this copper plate engraving really spread spread throughout. Now, I suspect this was probably done in the late 1800s or the late 1700s, early 1800s. And the reason I'm guessing that is because of the design of the copper plate. It's called the Fortune of War because in front of this 2-story building, there's a British flag and there's a tavern sign, and the tavern sign says Fortune of War. There's a woman, there's a girl, there are 2 soldiers, and there's a drummer all standing there, and it's if the woman is bidding goodbye, farewell to the soldiers. May have been during the Revolutionary War, may have been during the War of May 1812, who knows? It may have been later and it was simply commemorating it. This piece, though, is hand pieced and hand quilted, and you can get a sense of the quilting here with these tiny little diamonds quilted throughout the entire quilt. And then I think this is one of my favorite in the collection. This is a combination of a style known as broderie purse and radiant star. So remember that prior to the revolution, we would send Britain the raw goods, and they would send back finished fabric. And as time got closer and closer to the revolution, it got more and more expensive and trade got tougher and tougher. So you begin to see women reaching into their scrap bags to start using the fabric that's already there. And then another political thing that happened was after the Revolutionary War, now all of a sudden we could manufacture our own fabric. And we did begin to do that. And so you begin to see mass marketed calicos like this coming out on the market. Cotton was cheap, unfortunately, because of the enslaved labor force. And so this quilt could have been either right around the Revolutionary War period or right after the Revolutionary War period. By the early 19th century, these medallion style quilts are coming into vogue. This would be the medallion in the middle of it. This is a radiant star. You can see that the quilter also quilted all of these little diamonds around the edge of it, or pieced together all these little diamonds around the outside of it. And then she did this something called the broderie pierce, which means Persian embroidery. And what you would do with that is you would take a piece of chintz and you would carefully cut it out with all the nooks and crannies, and then you would applique it to your quilt. And so she appliqued all of these little pieces from probably just a piece of chintz that she got somewhere. You can see some of the match. But this style really stayed all the way through a good portion of the 19th century. In the 19th century, we really begin to see American quilts diverging from the European quilts. The European quilts were really more of just a simple assembly of piece blocks. They were randomly organized. They were not necessarily designed in patterns the way the American quilts began to be pieced together, and we'll see some of those in just a minute. There was also something else going on, and that was the cult of true womanhood, which coincided with the great religious awakening. And basically what it said was that women should be pious, pure, submissive, and live in an era of domesticity. That should be their sphere, in a sense. As one source that I was reading about said, in return for a husband's provision of security and protection, which by physical nature she required, the true woman would take on the obligations of housekeeping, raising good children, and making her family's home a haven of health, happiness, and virtue. And quilting fit nicely in that sphere, and she would get bonus points if she were frugal by reusing scrap material as well. By the late 1800s, we have the Victorian woman who now can demonstrate her wealth and social status by quilting quilts that don't have to keep anybody warm, but take her an incredibly long time to make. They're simply for show. She gets bonus points if she uses scraps too, but her scraps are now satins, brocades, velvets, and silks. I'd also, before I leave the 19th century, be remiss if I didn't mention that Elias Howe received the patent for the sewing machine in 1846 in America. Every single one of our 19th century quilts, as far as I can tell, are all made by hand. I did see somewhere where it said that the sewing machine, if a woman was lucky enough to have one, would be used for more of her utilitarian sewing, like her clothing, whereas quilting was much more of an art form to her. Whether that's true, I don't know, but I can tell you that none of our 19th century quilts are made by machine. The 20th century, I like to think that there were a whole bunch of quilters out there quietly quilting away, paying no attention to anybody or anybody paying attention to them. But there were a couple of points where it sort of flared up. And the first one was obviously the Great Depression, when frugality became a necessity. During this period, quilters could share patterns that were from weekly newspaper columns. They would buy feed sacks that began to package their seed in all different kind of fabric materials because the price of cotton had gotten so cheap. And women would go out and actually choose their feed based on the fabric that they wanted for their quilts. We have the Bicentennial, which made all things allegedly colonial popular. Good Housekeeping, in concert with the U.S. Historical Society and the Museum of American Folk Art, did a great quilt contest during 1976, and it received almost 10,000 entries. I imagine a lot of them looked like this Bicentennial quilt. And you can see this one actually says Bicentennial with the 2 years, 1776, 1976. And then you have around it all of the states and the year that they became states. And then we have the Art Quilt. And this is one by Bisa Butler, who some of you may have seen on Good Morning America about a month ago now. She has elevated the Art Quilt to just an amazing level. We were tracing her work this afternoon. She's now got an exhibit in Chicago if anybody happens to be going there, and she will be in a quilt exhibit, although not the sole exhibitor, at one of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She's an, I think it's East Orange girl, and so she's a local, and her work is really truly art. It is so evocative of the emotion, really spectacular. This picture comes courtesy of Montclair State University's magazine, but if you Google Bisa Butler, I'm sure you'll see lots on her. So now I want to really dig into our collection. As I mentioned, we don't always know who quilted them or when or where they quilted them. Even if we have a name, we don't know much about them. Unless we have information from the donor or we have other clues, we really have to just rely on the fabric and the style. Once a style comes in, it could be used for 100 years. So there's a limit to how close we can get. First one I want to show you is this string quilt. Some people call it a strip quilt. It's one of the earliest forms of quilting, which is why I started it here. Basically, what the quilter would do is take these long pieces of fabric, sew them together, and you might separate them by sashing strips, as this woman has done, creating the look, the real emphasis on the stripes. The exact date on this one is unknown. This technique was common from the early 19th century until the Civil War. The quilting on this is really quite spectacular. This one is also a string quilt, but entirely different feel. Instead, this one, the quilter created strings of fabric with all of these little patches, and then united them with this vibrant red fabric in between. Now, if you're familiar with antique quilts, you might ask if this is turkey red fabric. Turkey red was a dye that was widely used to dye cotton from the rubia plant that originated in India or Turkey, and that's why you get the turkey red name. They hadn't figured out how to dye cotton with it until after 1810. So if this is a turkey red fabric, we do know that they would have to be post 1810. I've read that it's pretty hard for the average quilt detective to try and figure out exactly if a fabric is turkey red or not. But they did say there were a couple of clues, and that is the red has retained a really vibrant color, which you can see here, it has. And there's also usually some degradation of the material, and you can see that here. This would be fairly common for it because it looks like this has been folded for 75 years. So that would not be an uncommon place of degradation, but the fact you see it elsewhere could be our clue. Now notice how this quilt is so much more rustic than the one I showed you before. It has much larger quilting stitches, emphasized by the fact that the quilt stitches are white instead of red to blend in with it. And the pieces here are all different widths. They're not in any particular order. Personally, I think that's what makes this quilt so endearing. And I would really love to know more about its history and who was the one who actually quilted this piece. You could say that this is another string quilt, but it's a variation. Today, it's a really simple pattern to make with rotary cutters and rulers and mat boards that heal themselves. But back in the day, this would not have been as simple as it is today. You'll notice when I get up a little closer to it, that it is made of cottons, it's made of velvets and some satins and some brocades tossed in there, which leads me to believe it was probably latter half of the 1800s. In a way, the fabric on there reminds me of my grandmother's quilt that started me on this whole process. And I think that's why it feels kind of special to me. Now, this one is a unique quilt. It was probably made in the early 19th century, and I'm guessing that because of the colors. They look like plant-based dyes that have faded over the years. Who knows what it might have looked like when it was new? It could have been bright greens and reds. But what's so interesting about this quilt is although it looks like a patchwork quilt, when you get up close to it, it's not. It's actually a whole cloth quilt that has been stenciled and then quilted. So we believe that this was done by the quilter, and she quite literally stamped things on it, stencil on it, so that she could create this image of a patchwork quilt. This is a postage stamp quilt, and it's called a postage stamp quilt because of the size of each one of those itty bitty squares, which are only an inch and a half big. So what this quilter did was she took 5 across, 5 down, a block of 25 right there. This block of 25 is all the same dark fabric. She'd attach it next to another block of 25 of the same fabric, and so on. But notice as she did this, that she really didn't work to put them in any kind of particular pattern. It was more randomly assembled blocks. We believe this was made around 1822 because the cottons and the fabrics in it are the same as another quilt that was attributed to a woman named Rosanne Guenvière Free that was dated to 1822. I've tried to find out information about her and have had no luck. I did find 2 immigrants, one coming in from Germany, one coming in from England, but there's been nothing definitive. It is hand pieced and hand quilted. And I just want to show you the quilting here. If you look, remember now, each one of these boxes is, probably not much more than an inch when you put the seams in there. And you can see that what she's done is she's made a square and an X through every single one of these little postage stamps. Quite incredible. Took her, I would think, forever. Take me forever. This is something called GoingSurrounded. We're moving up now a little in time to the mid-19th century. This beauty is a riff on a popular pattern that's still common today. It commemorates the British General Burgoyne's surrender in Saratoga in 1777. It's traditionally made with blue and white rather than red and white, but it really is quite striking, and really it's held up beautifully in all these times. And you can see up close the quality of that quilting. Also very tight stitches, very tight quilting, keep that batting in place. This is an Irish chain variation in our collection. The Irish chain, they believe, and there's a lot of legend associated with where quilts come from, or quilt patterns come from, but they believe this variation or this Irish chain really did start in Ireland in the early 19th century. A traditional Irish chain looks something like this. So you notice the difference. This is just a simple set of blocks that go down and intersect. And really, when you look at it, it's quite a simple quilt to make because you have a plain block and you put it next to a block that you've pieced together, and then a plain block and a piece next to each other. She's got the plain block here, see that? But instead of that just single blocks all the way down forming the X, she's changed it up a little bit. And she did that only by just switching around the order in which the dark and the light blocks fall in her quilt. So this is an Irish chain variation because of that. And what I love about this is that she boarded the 3 sides that would be seen on the bed, but then the top one, not worth the time. So she just sewed it with a little bit of white tape and left it there. So that's probably the part that went under the pillow or over the pillow and nobody could see. Now we're getting a little tougher in terms of making.
Jane, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
The Irish chain variation is one of the ones we used when we did our interpretations of those antique quilts. And
yes.
The blue and white one, when we looked at it, it looked like somebody had cut it in half.
Oh, really?
And that's why there was a white strip across the top.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. That's Glendora, who's speaking with the Nubian Heritage Quilters. And a couple of years ago, they did a program where they took our quilts and they created their own interpretations based on them. Thank you. I didn't know that. I haven't looked closely enough. I appreciate that, Glendora.
It looked like it was cut in half, probably made so that maybe two children or people could use it rather than one grand one.
Or one just fell apart, half of it fell apart and they cut it
Yeah.
off rather than not use it. Interesting.
Yep.
Interesting, thank you. So this is a Sawtooth quilt, and one of the hallmarks of a good quilter, in addition to her number of stitches per inch, is how she handles points. And this quilter did a really nice job with them. This is most likely turkey red because you can see how it's breaking down here. Other Sawtooth quilts are known by names like Bear Paw, Delectable Mountain, Sailboat, and my favorite, which is Duck's Foot in the Mud. Here's another beautiful one in our collection that uses Sawtooth, very vibrant considering it was made in the 1840s. And the most remarkable part about this one is that we know who made it. Her name was Maria Serling, not the greatest picture of her, but nonetheless, that's Maria Serling. She was born probably around 1800. She married a gentleman named Zenith Crane. She was living in Trenton. How she met him, I don't know, because he was living in West Bloomfield or Montclair. They got married on September 29th, 1821. So really, what, 6 days, 200 years ago. So pretty remarkable that we just happened to be featuring her tonight. This is the house that they lived on. This was on Bloomfield Avenue. And you can see it's no longer there, but you can see from this 1865 map that this was the property that was owned by Zenith Crane. And actually this was too. So it was somewhere along here that their house would have been. We don't know. So, but we do know she made this quilt, which is the most remarkable thing. And when you look at the quilt, it's remarkable unto itself. It's beautifully crafted and it has these really quite amazing quilt designs in all of the whites and as well in the reds, but you can't see the reds quite as much. This is a Wreath of Roses that's in our collection. I can't tell you much about it. It is an applique quilt. As a person who's not a great appliquer, I can tell you that one of the tough things to do is to create a really nice smooth design on a round surface like that, which she's done beautifully. She's quilted it nicely. This is what's called echo quilting, because it echoes the shape of the applique. At one time, it was probably vivid red and vivid green, and I'll bet it was quite beautiful. The Baltimore album quilt. By the 1840s, this new style had emerged. It's called the Baltimore album quilt. It's a type of friendship quilt where what happens is quilters would get together, or at the time, just women would get together. They would each create a patch, very often signed it, and then it would all be assembled together. And it might be a lovely present for a bride. I know that one was made for a minister by the women congregants. If somebody was moving out west, her friends might make her a friendship quilt to go on her merry way. This Baltimore quilt, which is very heavily appliqued, it was a thing really from about 1840 to 1852. One of ours, we call this the Boyd Scott quilt because there are several names on there. Some of them are Boyd, some of them are Scott's. And in trying to find some research on this, I did see that there was another M. Boyd who was in another Baltimore album quilt that sold about a year or two ago with Skinner Auction House. So it makes me wonder if perhaps M. Boyd, Mary Boyd, I don't know, M. Boyd was really involved with this group of quilters, and it was really from them that this whole genre of Baltimore album quilt emerged. Now, it was an enigma for me because it looked like it was just a quilt top. Somebody had attached a backing to it so it could be displayed more easily and hung. And actually, Pat Fornoff did confirm that with me, that that was done during her time with the Montclair Historical Society. What surprises me is the sashing on this is still incredibly vibrant. And I've wondered if this was modern fabric compared to the rest of it. I did check and it's all hand pieced, so I don't know. I guess it will still be a bit of an enigma for me. but it really is spectacular. And it is currently on display at the Crane House and Historic YWCA. We try and rotate out our quilts so that it gives them a chance away from the light. And this one happens to be out right now. Interestingly, in doing my research on this quilt, we came across this Star Ledger article from 1990, where the women from the Speartown quilters, and Pat was one of them, would actually make duplicates of some of the quilts in our collection and then raffle them off as a fundraiser for us. And they did this one and said it was really one of the hardest ones to do because of some of the intricacy of the squares. Now, some of them do look like they're from 1847, but like something like this to me just reeks of the late 1960s, early 1970s. So it's really a very progressive looking quilt. And I believe, Pat, this may have been the one you said was so difficult that you wound up sending it off to the founder of the Speartown Quilters and made her do it up in New England where she was living.
Very complicated pattern. Yep.
Very complicated, yes. This is known as a Lemoine Star. It has 8 points and 45-degree angles in it, and so it's quite a tough block to make. This is one of those ones where I love the legend of how it got its name. It is believed to pay homage to the Lemoine brothers who settled in Louisiana in 1699. It was known as the Lemoine Star in New England, also known as the Puritan Star. Here are a couple of theories of how it came to be. Versailles, where King Louis the 16th or King Louis and Marie Antoinette, I'm not sure which number, may have been the first location where it was used in the tiles. And the tiler was a man named Jean-Louis Lemoine. Now, I guess his cousins liked the style, and so Pierre Lemoine and Jean-Baptiste Lemoine, who settled in New Orleans, apparently incorporated it into their coat of arms. So says the legend. When I have Googled Jean-Baptiste or Louis Lemoine's coat of arms, I get nothing. So Google is not supporting this theory. It doesn't mean it's not true. It was also, we believe, called Lemoine because the English speakers couldn't figure out how to pronounce Lemoine. And so instead they just pronounced it as lemon. So that's how it became known as the Lemoine Star. So I'm now going to switch to the log cabin quilt. We have several variations of that in our collection, and it really is quite a remarkably versatile pattern. You create a log cabin by first starting here and then working around in a spiral format until you get to the end of your block. And you usually put all your darks together and you put all of your lights together. And how you lay them out really depends on the overall design that you get. So here's one that we have from somewhere in the latter half of the 1800s. This is one of the more recent additions to our collections. Someone came into our offices one day and told us that he picked up this quilt at a garage sale in Montclair in the South End many years earlier. He didn't know anything about the quilt other than he felt that it should not be just tossed away. So he picked it up. He said it was, he spoke to the previous owner who was African-American and had been in the family for 4 generations. Other than that, I know nothing about this quilt. So if anybody recognizes it and has some sort of background on it, please let me know. But notice the pattern of light and dark and how the quilter has placed these. Now, this quilt was made by a woman named Sophia Benson, Chendel Benson, and it's also log cabin, but she's kind of flipped it around a little bit, so she has an entirely different pattern than the previous one we just looked at. This is made with much heavier fabric, much fancier fabric. The outside is velvet, and you can even see this hand crocheted lace down at the bottom that she bordered it with. Really quite beautiful. She, interestingly, it's sort of tradition that you might use the middle would be a red block to symbolize the hearth, but she went instead with this nice, deep, rich black. She also made this quilt, which is a pineapple variation on the log cabin. So instead of being squares, you do it with a hexagon instead. And you can just see the comparison of the two here. So you can see the different shapes, but you can see how it clearly is coming from the same quilter. Even before I recognized that, to me, they looked like they belonged together. And here's the final log cabin I'm going to show you. It's a variation called Courtyard Steps. And instead of building it in a spiral, what you would do is you'd make your center one, and then you'd put two on either side, then you'd put them there, and then you'd keep building it that way instead of in a spiral. And so you get an entirely different look, even though you would never even realize it's not just a regular old log cabin. This is one that I just discovered, and it's called a Greek key, and it's also a variation on a log cabin, and it really starts with just two small blocks in the middle, and then you begin to spiral out and around it. And the reason I show you this is because this is the one that I'm working on right now. This is a close-up of that Courtyard Steps. You can see here, instead of having the red square, what she did was she put in an embroidered X as if to symbolize, yeah, I know it's supposed to be there, but I'm not going to do that. I'm breaking convention here. Or at least that's what I like to think she was saying. This is a crazy quilt. Now, crazy quilts were all the rage in about 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, short-lived. But you can see when you first look at it, all you see is like an explosion of different fabrics in there. But when you look really closely at it, you can see that it's actually made into squares, and then the squares are sewn together into a larger quilt. A good crazy quilt is going to, like she did, just go over that line just a little bit so that the lines are not quite as drawn on the grid. Now, this is remarkable unto itself with just the explosion of color and fabrics. But when you really look closely at this one is when you really, I could spend an hour just looking at this quilt, because throughout it, she has embroidered. And it's like a compendium of embroidery stitches on almost every single piece that she's put on here. And she's also done some embellishments. Look, you have a little bit of a spider's web there. She's dated it 1891. I'm assuming that's when she finished it, because also on there's an 1885, and it would not surprise me in the least if it took her 6 years to make this quilt. But notice you've got some flowers here. She has a staff of musical notes. There's a baseball, there's hearts. It's a remarkable undertaking, a truly remarkable undertaking. And at the very end, right at the corner, she added her initials. And all we know is her name is AAP. We have no idea who she is. She's gone to history, but at least she gave us some clue as to who she might be. So now we're going to move into the 20th century. We do have some quilts from the 20th century in our collection. This is Grandmother's Flower Garden, very representative of those early Depression quilts. Many of them were made with feed sacks. What's great about a Grandmother's Flower Garden is it's a great way to use up scraps, because you really don't need that much to create it. And a good Grandmother's Flower Garden is really an exuberant selection of all different quilts, like this one is, united by that single yellow center. So this is really quite pretty. It was the Grandmother's Flower Garden was based on the hexagonal quilts from the 18th century in England, but this really became its very own style. These are very recent to our collection. They just came in less than probably a month ago. There are 4 of these Hawaiian quilts, and we don't have any Hawaiian quilts in our collection, so I was delighted to get them. Hawaiian quilts came about starting about 1820 when the missionaries went to Hawaii. And now these women were trying to take traditional patterns that you might see in tapa cloth and use these new materials in order to take their style and put their mark on these new patterns. And we have 4 of them, 4 different colors, all very beautiful. We do need to do some work on them at this point, but as I said, they just came in and we're really excited about them. and what a part that they show us of quilting that we don't normally have anything of. I don't know, they don't look that old, but I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps they were made mid 20th century, right after Hawaii became a state and it was celebrating that statehood. But I could be completely off based on that. That could just be another legend I'm creating. And I'm going to finish with this beautiful quilt that you only see a portion of here. It's a whole cloth quilt. It is white work and it is phenomenally quilted. It was made by the Speartown Quilters in 1985. It was made specifically to be on the Revere bed in one of the bedrooms upstairs, or one of the chambers upstairs in the Crane house. You can see this beautiful cornucopia here, and it's called Harvest. And it really, I mean, there's trapunto in here. In a way, I felt it was really fitting to end on this one, because in so many ways, in both its quality, its style, its use of trapunto, it harkens back to that 14th century quilt that we looked at way in the very beginning. So we're really indebted to them for this beautiful quilt that we got. And I'm just going to now fill you in on the rest of the story of my grandmother's quilt. So many years after I'd learned to quilt, many quilts under my belt, finished this one as well, my aunt, her daughter, came to see me. And my aunt took one look at this and said disparagingly, "Ugh, that's not Mother's." And I said, "What do you mean it's not Mother's?" She said she never made quilts that looked like that. She must have just picked up those blocks at a garage sale. So somehow over the years, even though my grandma passed away when I was only 4 years old, she was doing her best to instill in me the same love that she had, a passion for quilting, and I'm really glad that she did. And now I'm open for any questions anybody might have.
I love that story that those blocks were picked up at a yard sale.
But see, I pick up plants or that at garage sales now, so it's so appropriate, right?
That's great. It didn't matter. It started you off on quite a journey.
It did. It did. And I'm delighted it did. So I love quilts. And although I don't quilt quite as much as I like to anymore, there's always time for that. So yeah.
Jane, any chance you'll restart that quilting class at the History Center?
Well, that's actually something that we were talking about at the 12 o'clock. We were saying that if there is an interest in a quilting class, please put it in the chat or let us know. You can send me an email at jane@montclairhistory.org. I was also talking to Pat that they may be looking for a place for the Speartown Quilters to meet again. And I said that it would be kind of nice for them to come back to the Crane House. So they may join us back again. So yeah, if there's enough of an interest, I'd be happy to run something.
Do you do much restoration on the quilts?
Excuse me?
Do you do very much restoration on the quilts?
No, textile restoration is really quite expensive. We would really need to get a grant for it in order to do it. And I would probably, it would have to be a long-term project where I am, you know, picking out some of the ones that are the most fragile and trying to get them restored before moving on to the next ones. Basically, we just try and take good care of them. As I said, we'll display them, but then we very often, you know, they'll only be out for a few months and then we'll put them back in acetate or cloth, like a linen cloth, put them in a dark place and let them rest for a while, and then pull them back out again in a couple of years.
Can you hear me? I know you can't see me.
I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, this was a great program. Thank you so much. I have a question though. Like in the 18th and 19th century, even I guess the 20th, did women sometimes dye their own blocks? Would they use vegetable-based, either plants for, you know, dyeing or coloring the blocks?
Yes, they would actually most likely dye the fabric before they turned it into blocks.
Okay.
So they wouldn't necessarily, it would be impossible to dye all those tiny little things. You know, if you were wealthy enough, you'd go to the general store and you'd pick up a bolt. Or you'd pick up a couple of yards, or you would take your latest ball gown and you would, you know, get the scraps from the dressmaker and turn it into a crazy quilt. But it was not always, but if you weren't, and you were out someplace where the general store wasn't an option, yeah, you would probably put your fabric together and you'd weave your fabric and then you'd dye your fabric.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. We were talking today, somebody asked how you can, if you don't quilt, how you could learn to quilt. And as I mentioned, I really learned by just popping a VHS tape into my tape recorder and watching videos. I really started to quilt right after the birth of my son. And that taught me a lot of the modern way to do it. So strip piecing. And so I learned that way first. And then, as I said, I took the class at the Montclair Historical Society in 1992, right after my daughter was born, and sort of learned the traditional way to do it. And so now when I quilt, I will flip back and forth between the two different ways to do it. You know, to try and get some sense of which is the easiest way. You know, I may start with something where I'm piecing by machine only to realize it's impossible and I switch to the handwork. So I kind of work it different ways. Just saw a question pop up. What was that question?
I have a quick question. We have a crazy quilt that is deteriorating. Is there something that we can do to retard the deterioration?
How is it displayed right now?
It's on a, I'm gonna try this.
If you want to keep it displayed like that, probably not a lot other than keeping it out of direct sunlight. You might want to make it a winter display and take it down during the summer months and just let it sit in either acid-free paper or 100% undyed cotton sheet or piece of fabric, and just keep it away for a little bit so that it doesn't always have that exposure. Erin, did I see that you're on? Did I miss anything? Erin is our manager of collections.
Yes. So one other thought I have is not having it hang totally at the top, having it hang at some sort of an angle that prevents stress at the top from where it's being hung. That stress of where it's being hung is going to start pulling at the threads. So if you just have it hung at like a slight angle, that really relieves that pressure.
It's mounted on a stretcher. On a stretcher.
Oh, it is. Okay, great. Good. That's good. And I would say, you know, even then, even still putting it at an angle is going to help relieve some of that stress. But Jane got most of the other thoughts I was thinking. So yeah.
Somebody asked whether or not we look at quilts. We look at quilts. I don't always have the answers for you. I can sometimes take a look at them and get a sense of what it might look like based on the fabric or the style. But I'm not an expert on dating quilts. That's a whole science unto itself. Happy to look at them though. I love looking at quilts. There's nothing I enjoy more than spending a morning looking at quilts. So
how many quilts do you have in your collection?
I would say between 30 and 40. Does that sound about right, Erin?
I'd say so, and most of that is not on display. We probably only have about 10 on display right now. The rest we do keep in storage, but about 30 to 40 sounds about right.
How did you acquire them? Did people donate them?
I wish we knew how we acquired some of them. Very often we get things in all different ways. Sometimes we come in on a Monday morning and we find a bag on our front porch and there's a donation in there. And we have no information about who donated it at all. Other times there is some information, but what happens is that the person may have found it in the attic, but really knows nothing about where it came from or who made it. That was the case with the Hawaiian quilts that just came in. She had no sentimental attachment to them because she didn't know who did them. And so she offered them to us. Unfortunately, this goes back in our history some 50 years at the Montclair Historical Society. And so, you know, there are quilts that have been donated by people who are long gone, who can't give us any information whatsoever. So that's the tough part, you know, trying to put it together. Like, for example, that Roseanne Guenvier Free, I would love to know more about her. I have played around on Ancestry trying to find her. I can't find any connection to Essex County at all. So how did her quilt wind up in our possession? I may never know. Either that or someday when I retire, that's going to become my full-time job. I'm just going to start researching every single one of these quilts in this collection.
That'll make you a quilt detective.
That would make me a quilt detective. Doesn't that sound like a fun job? I want a business card that says quilt detective.
Yes, it does.
All right. Anything else? All right, everybody. Thank you for coming. Have a good night. Stay dry. I hope there are no flash floods in your area.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane.